When the U.S. Civil War erupted in the spring of 1861, Venerable Augustus Tolton was only 7 years old. He was only 4 when the Supreme Court ruled in the infamous 1857 Dred Scott decision that the rights and privileges of American citizenship did not extend to black people, be they enslaved or free persons. So as a black child born in Missouri to parents who were slaves, young Augustus would have had little to convince him that his life would amount to anything or that anyone would care. But Augustus's family refused to be victims of a society turned against them. His father escaped to fight for the Union Army during the war, and although he died not too long afterwards, Augustus's mother bravely made a similar decision to flee with her 3 children across the Mississippi River into freedom. It was in Quincy, Illinois, that Augustus's family found refuge for many years, and it was there that he blossomed in the faith and heard a call to serve God despite numerous obstacles stacked against him. Both of Augustus's parents had been baptized Catholic under their former slave owners, and Augustus's mother worked to instill Catholic devotion and a love for Christ into her children. While in Quincy, the local pastor invited Augustus to attend the parish school, standing up to threats from fellow Catholics who objected to allowing a black student to learn side by side with their white children. As a teenager, when Augustus prepared to receive First Communion and confirmation, the same pastor realized Augustus might have a vocation to the priesthood. Unfortunately, at the time, no American seminary would enroll a black candidate, and so Augustus eventually left the U.S. to study theology in Rome. Ordained in the Basilica of St. John Lateran at age 31, he celebrated his first Mass at St. Peter's Basilica on Easter Sunday. Upon his return to the U.S., Father Augustus became the first publicly recognized black Catholic priest. Back in Quincy, though, financial hardship and growing racial tensions prevented him from taking up ministry in his hometown, and so he transferred to Chicago and later started St. Monica's Parish as an outreach to black Catholics, taking generous donations from the great philanthropist and future saint, Mother Catherine Drexel. A zealous servant of the poor, the sick, and marginalized, Father Augustus died at age 43. Father Augustus grew up in a time when basic human rights were denied people of color, and opportunities for economic and educational advancement often involved unfair segregation of whites from blacks. As they begin their second section of the pastoral letter, Open Wide Our Hearts, the U.S. bishops affirm that for a nation truly to be just, it must recognize and respect the legitimate rights of all people, regardless of wealth, color, language, or creed. Such basic human rights precede the organization of society itself because they flow from the dignity granted to each person as a son or daughter of God, created in His image and likeness. When God first created the human race, He created it for communion and relationship after the pattern of Himself, a trinity of persons, Father, Son, and Spirit, who share a mutual indwelling and a bond of love as one God. Just as God's essence is relationship, so too are human beings meant to be in relation with others. When we alienate and belittle members of the human family through discriminatory behavior and prejudicial attitudes, we fail to live into the plan that God has for us. Open Wide Our Hearts demands that our response to racism in our world today be threefold: to do justice, to love goodness, and to walk with humility. This first step, to do justice, entails that we critically examine our relationships with each other and work to reestablish communion with our neighbor, with God, and with all of creation. Taking a line from St. Augustine, the bishops point out that all too often our relationships are guided by a lust to dominate, to be better than the person next to us. Sadly, this lust to dominate has driven the long history of oppression against communities of color and indigenous peoples in our country. Racism continues against Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, Native Americans, and Muslim Americans because we have failed to fully acknowledge this history. The bishops express regret that we have taken up no moment of atonement, no national process of reconciliation, but instead passively allow our laws and institutions to deny justice and equal access to benefits and privileges based on race or ethnicity. As Catholics, we cannot sit back or shy away from the racism that still infects our nation. Yes, progress has been made, but racial inequality still widens gaps within the criminal justice system, healthcare coverage, housing and employment, school districts, and even access to fresh food and clean water. God's standard of justice is far higher than the standard we too often settle for on earth. God's standard of justice demands that no one be cast aside, left behind, or singled out as unworthy. God's standard of justice challenges us to act and to do what is right for all people. To take this first step of doing justice, however, we must first listen to the stories of our brothers and sisters whose lives have been and continue to be hurt by the evil of racism. These stories have historical roots in colonization, the slave trade, and waves of immigration, but continue today as poverty and violence afflict Black communities, xenophobic speech targets immigrant families, and deep-seated anti-Semitic or anti-Muslim sentiment attack religious minorities. We can read or listen to these stories secondhand, but the more important task remains in hearing them from people in our own local communities, responding with empathy, and committing to change. Open Wide Our Hearts calls attention in particular to experiences from those in Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous communities. Turning first to the Native American experience, the bishops highlight how deep wounds stemming from the years of colonization and expansion in this country remain largely unhealed today. Cultural suppression, seizure of ancestral land, forced relocation, violence, imprisonment, and abuse all mark dark chapters in the histories of many Native peoples as their languages, customs, and beliefs were judged inferior. Indigenous people died and traditions were covered over, all in the name of human progress and manifest destiny. As various cultures meet one another, a lack of compassion and a lack of mutual understanding only feed resentment and distorted judgments. True justice requires an encounter in which differences in culture are celebrated as mutually enriching opportunities to grow and offer thanks as one human family. The bishops next acknowledge the long persecution of Black men and women. Even before U.S. independence, people of African descent were bought and sold as property, often beaten, raped, and forced to work in extreme conditions. Black people were accorded subhuman status, and those in power thought nothing of separating families or enacting severe punishments. Even after slavery formally ended, Black individuals lived in fear of the white majority, and laws continued to prohibit their full participation in the political process for years to come. Open Wide Our Hearts laments that too many Black men and women continue to struggle against perceptions that they do not fully bear the image of God, that they embody less intelligence, beauty, and goodness. Even as our policies change, systemic racism continues to inhibit and hinder Black individuals from finding affordable housing, meaningful work, adequate education, and social mobility, resulting in an ongoing and vicious cycle of poverty and social segregation. Finally, the letter highlights the patterns of prejudice and discrimination against Hispanic communities. Like their black brothers and sisters, Hispanics are often subjected to derogatory names and labeled with negative stereotypes due to their ethnicity. The bishops note that Hispanics are the major target of immigration raids and mass deportation, deplorable acts which perpetuate cultural superiority, violent hostility, and utter disregard for the virtues of hospitality and welcome. Even now, some Hispanics are forced into an invisible existence due to governmental regulations and laws with racist undertones. Father Augustus's story of escaping slavery into freedom only to live in a society which didn't fully accept him is a story that too often gets played out even today. And unfortunately, too many people still live in some form of social, emotional, or economic slavery due to systemic racism in our institutions and individual racism in our thoughts and behaviors. Open wide our hearts admits that as a human family, we have not spent the necessary time to examine where racist attitudes of yesterday have become a permanent part of our perceptions, practices, and policies of today. As a country, as a church, and as human beings, we must raise the stories of those who have lived through racism to the surface. We must refuse to soften or leave out the painful and sinful parts of our country's history. Healing begins when we confront our mistakes. So we must acknowledge our wrongdoing, ask for forgiveness, and do justice by putting ourselves in right relationship again with all of our brothers and sisters. It's a task that requires vulnerability, courage, and openness to dialogue. But it's the task we are called to perform as God's children, beautiful in our differences, yet all made in His image and likeness.